welcome to World Olympic Association Olympic Climate Champions, and we're going to be talking about how we can save 1 billion tons of CO2.
The environment in the Olympics aren't obvious, and just as a framework for how the environment became part of the Olympic movement, just a few minute history lesson or story. If you want to learn more, I'll give you a reference. You can go kind of dive into it. But in short, in the late 80s, the IOC president was interacting with the United Nations, and at that time, the environment was starting to become a global issue. And nothing really happened, but the framework for the Olympic movement, if you look at the Olympic Charter, beyond excellence and friendship and respect and some of the core values in the Olympic Charter, is something called putting sport at the service of humanity. And that challenge was in the back of the mind of the IOC president on how the Olympics could be a steward or a catalyst or an active participant in trying to make the world a better place. So the environment and the Olympics really became crystallized from a host city. And the city was Lillehammer, Norway. And in the late 80s or in the mid 80s, Lillehammer and Norway were gearing up for an Olympic bid, and they were trying to understand their why, their reason for doing this. What was going to be a central thread, an organizing principle that was going to be a steward and be a catalyst for something of merit? How can we make a difference with this mechanism called the Olympic Games? And if you've been in Norway, if you know anything about Norway, they hold the environment near and dear to their heart. It's a centerpiece of their culture. And the Olympic Games is founded around sports and culture. And what they did was went on to produce what would later become known as the Green Games. And they operationalized, I think that's the right word, they operationalized the event. They operationalized the production, they operationalized the procurement, they operationalized the buildings and the venues, and all the way down to the forks and the plates that were recyclable. And if you're old enough to remember those days, they were ahead of their time. And they did it so well that subsequently the IOC in the upcoming year labeled them the Green Games, and actually through policy, and I'll talk about that in my section, through Olympic policy, baked or built the environment into the Olympic movement to stand alongside sport and culture. So sport, culture, and the environment now stand as pillars of the Olympic movement. And if you look through the games that have occurred since, you can kind of see activations. There are many more, but some of the highlights coming out of Lillehammer, Sydney took it upon themselves to embrace solar. Athens and Beijing really used mass transit. I know Ron could speak to the activations in London. But brownfield restoration certainly was part of the London Olympics. Tokyo, green hydrogen, circular recycling came into play. And again, these are just some high points. Now, did they do it perfect? Did they do it to the best of their ability? We can have a cocktail and talk about the pros and the cons, but in the end, the policy is forever written into the Olympic movement. And what are the Olympic Games? They're a few weeks, but they're a catalyst, if nothing else. And the athletes are I guess, ambassadors, and they can be leaders, right? And Beijing, massive urban transformation around reforestation. Then come toward the last games as we head into Milan. One of the challenges or one of the controversies surrounding the Olympic Games was building big white elephants, big things that never do anything after the fact. Well, Paris was the first Olympic city to really take on this retrofitting of existing venues and kind of a retrofit revolution, if as it were. And they used the super majority of the venues already existed. And if you look at Paris and Milan and LA going forward, that's been a really transformative sort of moment where 95% of the venues were already built in Paris, 93% here this upcoming several weeks in Milan. LA batting 100%. All the venues exist heading into Brisbane, and so that's been a transformative revolution. You'll hear from Ron some things around supply chain and whatnot, but really, there's a few Olympians and others on board that are trying to be trying to be catalysts around making a difference in your community. And one of the great examples that citizens of Paris get to experience every single day is the Seine River. The Seine River was a mess. The Olympic Games were a catalyst, and now they swim in it. The citizens swim in the Seine River. So if you want to understand a little bit more about the history of the Olympic movement, Lillehammer was really the catalyst, but it is set for the last 30 years now, a chain of events that the Olympic movement is trying to be a steward, trying to be a participant, and trying to be a catalyst around making a difference. So with that, I will leave it there, Ron, and I will stop sharing and turn it over back to you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm just trying to get into my presentation, which is in a different thing. To begin with, I'm just going to sort of go through my sort of story, and let me know if you're not seeing the screen. But my life was literally started by skiing, because my parents in the picture actually met through skiing, and they lived on opposite sides of Scotland. So my dad actually, having met my mum, burnt out 2 engines driving back and forth across Scotland to go and see her. I started to ski when I was 4, just down the path here in our garden overlooking the sea. That was back in 1966, when it used to snow all over the place in Scotland, and our main problem was too much snow, so we couldn't get up to the mountains. By 1976, we've got Franz Klammer here winning the Olympic downhill, and today is the 50th anniversary of the start of the Innsbruck Winter Olympics. His race was actually tomorrow, but it was a pretty crazy and spectacular run. It's gone down in legend because Barnard started off number 3 and looked like he was winning because nobody could beat him, and Klammer was behind all the way until he got to the finish. And that moment was made possible because the Austrian army transported 25,000 tons of snow onto the piste to make it happen. So climate change was already hitting the Olympics that early on. So, it's not something that's new to us in snow sports. I won my first downhill when I was 17 in 1980, and I was at my second Olympics in 1992 before I retired. And in the late 80s, we used to be able to ski in the summer in the Kitzsteinhorn, and I actually remember powder skiing in June, which was like the longest day of the year, and it snowed powder then. And just a few years later, there was no glacier there. I went back there in December because I thought it was sure of snow, and the glacier was completely melted down. And this bit up here on the right-hand side, there was a little patch of snow there and a little toe that went for sort of about 100 meters. We were able to ski that year, and now that's gone completely as well. So it's been a big change around. And so by I also was involved in buying a ski resort in the late 90s. So I was really aware of climate change and what the impact was. And so when I was invited as a sort of fellow of the RSA to go into a carbon trading project where we sort of went off, measured, reduced, and traded our emissions, I was really keen to do it. And so, I swapped cars, went from a Jaguar to Prius, switched all the light bulbs, got about a 50% reduction in that measured emissions, which is scope 1 and 2. That's the energy you use, that's sort of gas, electricity, fuel, etc. But it's really obvious to me that the majority of emissions were outside of that. And that's kind of where my interest was how do we measure the carbon and everything else that's bought. And so in 2006, we'd just done a fraud detection project, and we sort of grew the team. And I'm the only one that's not a PhD or a professor in this group. We've got 5 professors and 3 PhDs looking at you. And by 2010, we got a good AI system for measuring all the products, what they were, and then calculating carbon footprint. It was breakthrough by a couple of other professors, John Barrett and Tommy Wiseman, who helped us with the other side of it and put the whole lot together. And then by 2010, it expanded to doing the whole of NHS England, it was about 150 billion of spend. So it's quite a lot. And since then, we've now done 2.5 trillion, coming up for 600 million tons of CO2, most currencies, most countries, and about 65 million product carbon footprints across 2.5 million suppliers. So we've managed to measure it all, but what people don't understand is that even something as simple as an apple actually has a supply chain. There's a bunch of people that are responsible for getting the apple grown, then you've got to pick it, then pack it, and then you've got the distribution side of things. So that's about the simplest. But in that food supply chain, this is an orchard in Kent, which is where we're just about to be moving to when we sell our house, if it doesn't fall down in the meantime, having had a burst pipe in the attic. They've got 100% of those apples are wasted because they didn't have pickers to pick them. And across the food supply chain, it's about 40% that usually gets wasted, and 50 to 60% of that waste is avoidable. And this is the simplest of supply chains. You then go off into some of the mechanical stuff, and each one of these exploded out components is another complete exploded out set of stuff, and it goes on down. So we've done stuff in the automotive industry, and that supply chain is 20 levels deep. Construction is quite a bit simpler. We've actually gone from a housing association to builders merchant to the brick manufacturer, and calculated every supply carbon footprints all the way through. And in terms of agenda, I'm really thankful to Joss for introducing healthcare so you get an idea of the complexities. That's a complex supply chain, but it's a supply chain that's actually doing stuff.
It's a pleasure here to be sort of figuratively sharing the podium here with some Olympians, and the Olympian Climate Champions is it's an inspiring idea, and it builds on the history that Jeff was just talking about in the Olympic movement around sustainability. I'd rather talk about that actually than healthcare and supply chain. I'm not an Olympian by far. I'm a surfer. And I'm more into the lifestyle of it and than the competitive sports part of it. But I have tremendous respect for the Olympic movement. And at the same time, one of the things that we need to do is connect the different pieces of the work here. And so my organization, Healthcare Without Harm, works to help healthcare reduce its own environmental footprint, become more climate resilient, and advocate for environmental health and justice in the world. And so what Ron's asked me to do today is to talk a little bit about healthcare supply chains and kind of drill down on procurement as well, as a strategy to address these issues, which connects again with the Olympic movement in that the Olympics buy a lot of stuff to build things, to build venues, and to actually for the event itself. And so decarbonizing our supply chains and making them more climate resilient and adaptive is a really, really important thing to take on if we're going to address the climate crisis. So let's talk a little bit about the healthcare industry and global supply chains. So the health sector is 10% of the world's GDP. A significant proportion of that, and we'll get into the numbers of it in a minute, is derived from the production and distribution of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, vaccines and other inputs, as well as the purchase of food and medical gowns and building materials and energy. And so the healthcare supply chains in the world are increasingly globalized and increasingly complex. They involve numerous suppliers from across multiple countries. For example, pharmaceutical trade has expanded, and they're huge, right? Pharmaceutical trade has expanded 10 times in the last 30 years and now accounts for 4% of the value of global trade. And that's significant if you think about it. And medical devices are another 3% of global trade. So, health systems, your local hospital, your local health center, wherever you live, relies heavily on both local and global supply chains to source not only the pharmaceuticals and medical devices and vaccines, but also energy, building materials, food, and services. To keep our health systems running, it depends on this very complex beast. And as we are learning, these supply chains are very vulnerable to climate disruption. The supply chains, they work in some ways really well. They're designed for efficiency. They're centered around concentrated industrial hubs. They're optimized for just-in-time demand with minimal buffer stock. But that makes them vulnerable. So a shock to one part of that system in one country can disrupt the entire distribution of an essential medicine, for instance. And we saw this with COVID-19. We saw how vulnerable our supply chains were when the pandemic hit 6 years ago. So we're already witnessing the impacts of climate disruption on the healthcare supply chain. And here's a few examples from Puerto Rico, from India and China and the United States that you can read here on this slide. But needless to say, as the climate crisis accelerates, so will the impacts and the disruptions of the healthcare supply chain, which means real life impacts on people who depend on medicine, and on health systems that depend on all of these different inputs to be able to provide the care that people need all around the world. And here's the paradox, is that in addition to that vulnerability, the health sector is responsible for 5% of net global greenhouse gas emissions. This means that if healthcare were a country, it'd be the 5th largest carbon emitter on the planet. That's huge. It's like the emissions of 514 coal-fired power plants come from healthcare. So it is both vulnerable and it is part of the problem, the health sector. And a big part of that comes from the healthcare supply chain. In fact, 83% of healthcare's emissions come from supply chains. And you can see in this chart some of you are probably familiar with the different emission scopes. Scope 1 is on-site emissions, Scope 2 is purchased energy, and Scope 3 is supply chain. And this is how carbon footprint is measured across all sectors. And if you break it down, Scope 3 is about 70% of healthcare's emissions. And you can see in the list on this chart where that comes from and the percentages where it comes from. And you can see that pharmaceuticals are huge, for instance. Medical instruments are significant. Anesthetic gases and other chemicals are significant. Food is significant, et cetera. And in addition to that, healthcare is buying energy off-site. And that's Scope 2 emissions, which is another almost 13%. So if we're going to decarbonize the healthcare supply chain and to decarbonize the sector, I should say, we need to address not only the low-hanging fruit of transforming the operations of our hospitals and health systems so that they're low carbon and climate resilient, but we also need to address the production and distribution and disposal of all these different goods and services that I'm talking about. What do we do about this? We know that there's a problem. We know that there's vulnerability. We know that there's emissions. And the health sector in the last 5 years has begun to really mobilize and organize to address this. And this really, one of the turning points in this effort was at COP26, the climate negotiations in Glasgow, Scotland in 2021, where a number of national governments made two commitments: one for climate resilient health systems that are set to adapt to the climate crisis, and two for sustainable low carbon health systems. And that morphed into something called the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate and Health, ATTACH, which now has more than 100 national governments and national ministries of health that have made these commitments, including to develop a sustainable low carbon health system, including supply chains. So there is a significant commitment, and there are a number of other sort of different global declarations and commitments from governments and other leading actors in the health sector saying we need to do this, right? So one of them was the G20, which a couple of years ago established 5 high-level principles for healthcare climate action to build climate resilient health systems, low carbon health systems, low carbon and climate resilient supply chains, to develop finance for climate and health, and to promote One Health. And so the question now and the challenge is, how do we implement this? We've got everybody on record saying they're going to do it. But the challenge is actually in making it happen on the ground. And so one of the things that my organization did is we worked with the Asian Development Bank and an organization called UNITAID, which some of you may be familiar with, that is connected with the World Health Organization, to develop for Principle 3 a framework and a series of strategies for low carbon climate resilient healthcare supply chains. And we published that paper recently. If you Google it, you can find it on the Asian Development Bank website. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today kind of comes from that paper. So one of the things that we identified were that there are these 5 key elements for low carbon climate adaptive health products. And these can be translated into other sectors as well. This doesn't have to necessarily be about healthcare for the most part, or most of it. So one is that the products are climate proof. For instance, heat resistant drugs. A lot of drugs that are produced are they go bad at a certain heat. And as we have increasingly extreme heat around the world, those pharmaceuticals are less effective or ineffective. And so that's one, that they be low carbon, that they be tailored for climate sensitive health issues. So as malaria spreads, for instance, we need to figure out a way, or dengue, to address those problems, that they be locally produced so that it promotes local economies and also can help avoid the global disruption that I was talking about before, and that they be integrated into what are overall more climate smart supply chains in terms of logistics, and production logistics, distribution, all of that. So those are some sort of very basic elements. And then based on those elements, we identified 6 key strategies for climate resilient healthcare supply chains. And these strategies fall into sort of 2 areas. One is the actual supply chain itself, and 2 is what we're calling the enabling environment. So we need to, the strategies are health product design and innovation, manufacturing, logistics. And again, logistics is everything from once the product's manufactured to how it actually gets to the health center in a rural setting in Africa or in a large hospital in the UK. Procurement becomes one of the enabling factors, which we're going to drill down on a little bit today. Regulation, norms and standards, and finance. These are the tools that we can use to help enable the first 3 strategies. So altogether, these 6 strategies are super interconnected. It's very difficult to take one alone, but together they can help forge a transformation of our global supply chains that actually allows us to be more climate resilient in the health sector and similarly in other sectors. And when I say they're woven together, if you look at this chart, there are a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different actors here that can take part in some of these different strategies, whether it's the Ministry of Health or a public health system or other national ministries, private health systems, healthcare supply companies and pharmacies, multilateral banks, UN and bilateral aid agencies, private capital, philanthropy, non-governmental organizations, and academia. Everybody has a role to play if we're going to actually make the change that we need to see. So drilling down on procurement, we identified, with each of those strategies, we identified some top priority actions. And you can see here that there are 5 priority actions for procurement, and we're going to hear a little bit from the NHS about how some of this procurement is working in the UK and how they're moving toward low carbon, climate resilient procurement. And these are the 5 areas that we sort of identified, which is developing comprehensive frameworks that incorporate health products, food, and energy, building the capacity on the ground for procurement professionals, because there are people out there in these health systems and in any big institution that buy the stuff, and they need to understand how to do what they need to do. And they need to learn to do it in a different way than they've done it traditionally. We need to prioritize climate resilient products, leverage collaborative procurement mechanisms. This is a really important one. One hospital trying to buy things sustainably, that's a good thing. But if you get 100 hospitals, it increases your purchasing power. If you get 10 or 20 governments saying they're going to do the same thing across their national systems, then that's huge. And it can help put pressure on the manufacturers, send market signals for innovation, and also impact the logistics and distribution. And that helps encourage, and there are other ways to encourage suppliers and manufacturers to decarbonize. So those are the priority actions for procurement, and I'm assuming we'll hear more from the National Health Service of the UK in a little bit around this. And then, one other point here, which is that the way you identify what the, what a low emissions product is, has a few different pieces, and it's often called a life cycle assessment. And this can help identify key emissions throughout a product's manufacturing, distribution, and disposal, and then allow you to make the changes that we've been talking about. And so some of the criteria for a life cycle assessment is how reusable is a product? How energy efficient is it? What is its origin and location of manufacturing? Again, is it local, or is it having to be shipped across the world, or some pharmaceuticals are shipped across the world 3 times back and forth between different countries as it's produced before it ends up at the user? What kind of packaging is being used? How durable is the product? Can it be reused? And whether the producer takes extended producer responsibility for the waste that's produced at the end, or whether it just ends up in a landfill. And so these are some key areas. And again, this is sort of all of this is super high level. I'm just touching on some stuff. You can find more in the report we did with the Asian Development Bank. And I just want to leave you with this last thought, which comes from that report, which is that all of this needs to happen in the context of climate justice and health equity. That means that the work that we do needs to be able to get better access for people to health and make sure that there's universal health access around the world. We need to keep that in mind as we do this kind of work, and that that there is an element of justice in terms of supporting the communities and countries that are most impacted by the climate crisis, and assuring that their needs and interests are raised up. So you can see the quote there. You can read it. I won't read it out to you. And that's all for me. Thank you so much for listening. Back over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I'm going to be handing over to Heidi, who's going to explain what she's doing at NHS Supply Chain, and how that's working in the NHS. And so I'm just going to see if Heidi can Yep, Heidi's coming in.
Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Heidi Barnard. I'm head of sustainability for an organisation called NHS Supply Chain. We are a part of the NHS family in the UK. So the UK health system is obviously, as you may know, publicly funded. And we sit within that organisation, and our role is to procure goods and services on behalf of the NHS, and we also have a logistics and distribution function. So we have our own warehouses and we deliver into every trust in England every day. So I'm going to share my screen momentarily, so hopefully this will work. Let me know when you can see it.
And it's there. Thank you, Heidi.
Brilliant. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because I'm conscious that we have time. And thank you for the introduction. I don't have to explain the complexity of healthcare systems and our supply chains. That's already been eloquently done for me. But the UK context is really interesting. So back in 2020, amongst the pandemic, the NHS actually set out a really ambitious targets when it comes to net zero and climate. So we set a 2040 target for net zero for our direct emissions and anything we can directly control, and a 2045 target for all of our indirect emissions, which is where our scope 3 comes into. And hopefully some of you will be familiar with the work that we've done and see some of these targets that we have, and seen some of the delightful infographics that we present at every given opportunity. And as NHS Supply Chain, we are the main route to the NHS of a lot of those goods that come into the hospitals, the doctors' practices on a daily basis. So that 2045 is really interesting. So for some people, that seems really quite ambitious and challenging. For some people, 2045 is 3 Olympics away. So why are we? What's the hurry? So one of the things, and one of the ways I try and explain it to people, is to think about it in the context of a child's life. So I joined NHS Supply Chain in 2022. So that's why the year 2022 is the year zero. But if you think about how quickly a child grows and how quickly those years pass, you soon realise that whilst it might seem a long way away, actually there's a lot we need to do now. And particularly in scope 3, where a lot of the activities and actions we take years to work through those very long, very complex supply chains, then the imperative is an urgency is right now. And underneath those 2 big headline targets of 2040 and 2045, we also have interim targets. So our 80% reductions by 2030-ish and 2036-ish for the big targets. We also have a series of smaller milestones, and that's talking to things like we have a supplier roadmap, so things we're expecting suppliers to do at dates between now and 2030. We have waste targets. We have targets around transport and emissions. So all of these things build into that timeline and the incremental steps we need to be able to get where we're going. And we've seen the impact that the supply chain has on healthcare in general, but specifically within the NHS, we've done our own footprinting, and this was recently updated in the 5 years on report that came out late last year. And our scope 3 is actually grown as a proportion of our impact, which is not a surprise. As we have got control and really tackled those direct impacts, the proportion of your indirect impacts is going to grow. So we're now 72% of the overall NHS impact comes from its indirect emissions. But as NHS Supply Chain, whose job it is to buy that stuff, actually over 98% of our emissions are in our scope 3 footprint. Our offices and our warehouse, as big and wieldy as that logistics operation is tiny in comparison to the products that we supply, and that's because of the scale of what we do. As I said, we deliver over 650,000 products on our catalogue that go into hospitals every day of the year, bar Christmas Day. And one of the things that is really interesting to see when you look at the data is our emissions over time. So you can see in 2021 there was you may have noticed there was a little pandemic, And all of the UK's response to that pandemic went through NHS supply chain. So if you think about the PPE in particular, and that had tripled our emissions that year. Now, you'll also notice that as we've come out of that pandemic, we almost got back to normal. But we've never quite got back down to the levels that were just in 2020. And last year we saw a big tick up. And some of that is around the some of the geopolitical issues we're seeing, some of the factors around some of the products that we're seeing, the product mix that we're now delivering into hospitals, but also it's around changing care pathways. So one of the really interesting things is a number, it tells a story, but it doesn't tell the full story. And that's where we need to get into the devil of the detail, and where some of the work that CO2 analysis and work that Ron does has been helping us develop our own strategy. So when I break that data down into all of the different things that we buy and think about the categories we buy in, our medical and surgical consumables is our biggest hotspot for products. But when I break it down into individual contracts, I've got some contracts in other categories that are up in my top 10 in terms of impact. So this is really helping us focus in on, well, what are the products that we need to focus on, and what is the mechanism? Is it about reducing the amount of that product we're buying? Are we over consuming it? Are we wasting it? Is it a product that is going obsolete? Actually, if we think about how we deliver care in the next 5 years, that's going to change. So actually, we need to be phasing out that product and bringing in a different thing. Or is it that actually that product is here to stay? It's a relatively new product, and this is where the suppliers really need to tackle their own scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and how do we drive that behaviour in our supply chains? And what all of this data allows me to do is develop our own strategies and programs of work that we're going to deliver. So I've touched on our offices, our warehouses, and our fleet. And whilst it is only 2% of our footprint, it is our biggest visible footprint. We also outsource the logistics and warehousing contracts. And one of the big things we've done over the last 2 years is retender that contract. So we have built in the requirements into our logistics contract for those suppliers to meet our roadmap on net zero because a condition of that contract. So it is a key performance indicator. We've also done similar on our estate strategy. You perhaps can't see behind me, but I'm currently sat in one of our new offices. Again, we've gone through some same changes over the last few years and been redoing our estate strategy and consolidating our estate. And again, a fundamental key principle within those estate strategies has been driving the buildings so that when we occupy them, they are going to be the ones that are going to meet our 2030 deadline around our interim targets. So there's no point us going out to lease a building if it's never going to be able to help us hit our net zero in 2030 when we're signing leases that are often between 5 and 10 years long. So that's kind of the scope 1 and 2, which is not really the focus of today. But when it comes to our scope 3 and actually our role in the system to buy things for the system, this is where our commercial activities become really key. And those 3 main levers we have to pull on in order to drive out emissions in our supply chain. And this is where our buy less, buy better, buy different strategy really comes into play, because these are our big 3 levers that we've got. So the buy less is actually not about our suppliers at all. This is about understanding what we're buying, and when we're buying it, what are we doing with it? Are we actually using it, or are we wasting it? Are we actually over consuming it and actually using products that we do not need to use? So things like gloves and aprons and couch roll, we know there's a proliferation of use of these products which are not meeting a clinical need. So how do we work with the hospitals and the healthcare system to drive out that unwarranted variation and that unintended use and unnecessary use? So that's all around behavioural change. So that's the first lever that we have to pull on. And we're developing a whole bunch of support to help our customers understand where they've got these opportunities. The other really handy thing about this one is it helps them spend less money. And in a very money-constrained system, which is a public health system, that is gold dust. So again, we've got a real value lever to say, actually, we can save you money. Let's look at how you're spending your money on gloves, on all of these things that are overconsumed, and how we can drive you some savings in that space. Buy better is all about what our suppliers can do. So this is where our suppliers come in. So when we think about healthcare and think about how we are, the conditions that we're seeing in our populations, and the interventions that we're seeing in our populations. Healthcare can be split into kind of two pots. You've got medical interventions that weren't available 5-10 years ago. So that cutting edge of, we treat cardiac disease, we treat cancers, we treat so many things that we never used to. So that's all new stuff. But there's also a set of products that we've used for decades. So if we think about syringes, if we think about wound dressing, so there's a bunch of stuff that was probably going to be the same in 5-10 years time as it is now. That's the stuff we need to buy better. So if we still going to be needing to use syringes, if we're still going to be needing to use dressings, how do we drive out the carbon and the other environmental and social impacts in those supply chains to deliver the better result? So how is it being made? What's it being made from? Where are those suppliers operating from? What energy mix are they using? How do we drive that out? That's what Buy Better is about. Buy Different is about that second set of, well, actually the innovation and the changes in healthcare, the changing demographics, changing population, health issues we have, how are we redesigning care pathways? The UK has a new strategy around healthcare, which was part of last year's government announcements around the 10-year health plan. There's a lot more move to digital, there's a move to community, and there's a move to prevention. Those are all things that speak to sustainability, but also how do we then make sure we build that into our procurements? If we're not going to be treating cancer the same way, if we're not going to be treating people in a hospital, we're going to be treating them at home, how does that change what we need to buy? How do we build that into our procurement? And then that procurement, then what do we physically ask for as part of that procurement? I split this into two things. We've got, and they're both the two sides of the same coin. So there's the assurance piece of the things that we need our suppliers to be doing, the things that are the non-negotiables in order to work with us and buy and to be part of the NHS supply chain. This is what you need to do. And then we've got the opportunities. So what is it that they're doing? What are the innovative products that they've got? What are the changes they're making to their products and their packaging and their delivery mechanisms that are driving that sustainability option? And it's those two things together that are driving the value for the NHS system and driving sustainability for the NHS system. I'm going to briefly touch on what our 5 key requirements are, so that these are the non-negotiables for our supply chain, and then we'll move forward from there. So we've got a carbon reduction plan. So every supplier has to have a carbon reduction plan. There is a template that they have to fill in, and it is their scope 1, scope 2, and a subset of their scope 3 emissions. If they do not have that, they do not pass go. They are not on they do not get one of our contracts. We have a 10% weighting on social value on all of our procurement. So again, they have to answer questions around social value and demonstrate what they're doing in that space. NHS England developed the Evergreen Assessment, which is a standard platform that is free to access for all of our suppliers. It means that as the NHS, rather than have a proliferation of supplier questionnaires, we ask them once and everybody in the NHS can access it. They all have to complete the Evergreen Assessment in order to get onto one of our frameworks. We do a huge amount of questions. We ask a lot around the horizon scanning, and this is to understand the upcoming regulation changes across the environmental remit across the globe. So a lot of our supply chains are international, so understanding changes to modern slavery regulations in Germany or what's happening in plasticizers and plastics around the world really helps us understand what's coming, what those supply chain issues are going to be, and what we need to work on to support the whole system. And the 5th element is all around modern slavery. So we have a huge amount of due diligence that we do in our supply chains to maintain the standards that we expect around modern slavery. My slides have stopped moving, so let's go on to this one. So in terms of that data then, so we talked about what this allows us to do. So I've got a good projection now from the data I've got around what we expect to happen and where we're going. So we talked about that scope 3 emissions and our trajectory over the last 5 years and how we had that big pickup in the pandemic and how we've reduced down a little bit, but it's not quite where we want it to be. And this is where we need to layer in. So how do we know that Buy Better, Buy Different and Buy Less is actually going to help us achieve our net zero goals? So that Buy Better and getting suppliers to do what they want to do, because of the information that I'm getting from them, from their evergreen assessments, because they're telling me all of the detail around their their programs and what they're doing, I can use that to map against what our expected demand is against those emissions around where they're saying they're going to be. So what are the suppliers' targets? What are the goals that they've set? How are they achieving and their progress on those goals? I can plot out actually what that means in terms of decarbonisation of our supply chains. When I can then map in the buy less and buy different, and that gets to about 80% of the way there. And if I look at that from our 2030, so interim target point of view, but also the 2045 point of view, that buy better and what suppliers have already committed to achieving gets us to 80% of our target. The buy less and the buy different is what is the gap to net zero. That is the gap to how do we drive out what suppliers can't decarbonise. This is why we need to concentrate on actually be thinking and being about what we buy much more carefully and making sure we're only buying the things we need to and not wasting things in the system, but also thinking to the future and making sure when we are buying different, that sustainability is designed in from the start and isn't an afterthought. So we are designing care pathways which are lower carbon, which are lower environmental impact throughout their lifetime, so we don't end up in a position where we're designing in emissions that we don't want in 10-15 years time. Now, I'm really conscious of time, and I know that has been a whistle-stop tour of the work that we're doing, but I wanted to make sure I gave you a highlight and chance for any questions in the time that we had.
Does anyone want to type in some questions into the chat?
I've got a quick question before I go for Heidi.
Yeah, go for it.
So I don't see pharmaceuticals listed in the your scope 3. I'm wondering, is that under consumables, or have you removed it from your calculations, or?
So NHS, and this is where the intricacies of procurement in the NHS. So NHS supply chain, we don't actually supply pharmaceuticals into the NHS. NHS England manage those, a lot of that portfolio. The interesting thing is that we are starting to pick up a few of the distribution contracts for vaccines. So again, one of the reasons our emissions kicked up in the last year is because we've taken on some of the vaccine distribution work, and therefore that's now coming into our scope 3. So that's the reason you didn't see it called out explicitly.
So for the NHS overall, the supply chain would include pharmaceuticals, but not for your vision.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Heidi's division, NHS supply chain, is focused. It does everything from the biscuits to the hotel supplies to all the medical devices, maintains the MRI scanners, lots and lots of stuff. It's an incredible thing. She didn't mention it, but I'm going through her data, and they've identified 1 million products with countries of origin, which is incredible given that they only supply 400,000 of them. So they've done a great job of looking out more widely. And I know because we actually measure hospitals, ambulance trusts, mental health trusts, and community trusts, and each one of those has different bits. That pharma always comes up very high. It's a major part, but it depends. If it's a cancer treatment center, it's going to be the cancer drugs. If it's community, it may, it's a range of different things. It's different things for mental health. Each specialty has a different set of drugs, because we've been going through all that sort of measurement, Josh.
Great, thank you. I do have to jump. Thanks so much. Great to see everybody, and look forward to the Milano Olympics, and see you doing great work leading up to the LA Olympics, and let's get the surfers involved.
Yep, sounds great. I'm going to hand over to Graeme now, unless there's any further questions. I've not seen any in the chat yet. So.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Okay, that's great. I'm just going to share my screen. I do have a couple of slides, Ronald.
Okay, brilliant.
Won't be a sec. Okay.
Yeah, and Jeff's going to be back on again after you.
Okay, no worries at all. Okay, there we go.
Great, we can see it.
You can say that. Okay, I'll just go from the beginning. Okay. Here we go. Okay, my name is Graeme McKenzie-Netherwood. I'm the head of ESG for the PHS group. I'm really glad to be following Heidi, actually, because there's quite a lot of synergy between her presentation and mine. So a bit about my own sustainability journey. I was born and brought up in the Lake District, in this Lake District, and I've previously worked in head of sustainability roles for Mighty, big FM sort of company, for Sellafield Limited, the central government, and also the NHS Shared Business Services, which is where the synergy with Heidi comes from. I've sort of really become a sort of gamekeeper turned poacher because I joined the PHS group about 2 years ago. Now, for those of you who don't know who PHS are, we are the leading hygiene services provider in the UK, Ireland, and Spain. We provide fully serviced hygiene solutions and expert advice to all types of industries, including the NHS, public sector, major facilities management companies, supermarkets, coffee and restaurant chains, as well as education, sports stadia, and hospitality venues. Now, our main businesses are washroom, healthcare, and floor care hygiene, where we sell and service products such as sustainable floor mats, recycled sanitary bins, air purification products, air fresheners, water use reduction products, and even consumables such as toilet roll and period products. We also have a number of specialist businesses that offer a range of diverse products and services, from the installation of LED lighting and EV chargers to workwear laundry services, crate rental, and from cardboard compactors to planting services and the installation of living walls. We've got a very successful care home supply business, and we even supply more than 2,500 Christmas trees to businesses every year. So a very diverse business. Now, PHS has just over 3,000 employees. We have more than 120,000 customers in 300,000 locations, and we carry out more than 20,000 service visits a day, which is an incredible amount. We've got a fleet of 2,000 vehicles, including more than 100 HGVs, 1,300 vans. So as you can imagine, reducing our Scope 1 emissions is a major focus for us. And like a lot of companies, we've chosen 2040 as a net zero target date. Like most companies, the board chose this date because they'll all be retired when it comes around. Now, our pathway to net zero involves both decarbonisation of our estate, which covers more than 60 buildings, and an absolute reduction in our fleet and Scope 3 emissions. So we're well aware of the 5 key NHS strategy requirements that Heidi outlined. And what we're trying to do is we have a carbon reduction strategy in place. We're already working on initiatives to reduce our Scope 1 emissions, and also we're introducing more EVs into our fleet. And we're also ongoing trials with HVO fuel. We've also introduced electric cargo bikes into our inner city depots, which is proving to be such an excellent innovation. We've recently doubled our cargo bike fleet. And we're also increasing our on-foot services. And we recently introduced hybrid company car options, all to reduce our Scope 1 emissions. Now, our Scope 2s, we buy all of our electricity from REGO certified renewable sources. But we're also in the process of removing our data centre from our Caerphilly HQ off-site to reduce energy costs. And we're installing solar panels on the roof of the HQ to make further savings. And in addition, our primary warehouse facility in South Yorkshire also has a solar panel array covering the roof. So that's all well and good. So what are we doing about Scope 3 emissions? Like most companies, we currently measure only a small amount of Scope 3 emissions. And the key for us is close collaboration with our supply chain, but also being able to calculate the carbon footprints for the products we buy and the products we sell. Now, our procurement team, alongside with myself, are already talking to our supply chain about their strategies to reduce Scope 3 emissions. But what about those product carbon footprints? Well, our top 100 suppliers contribute 65% of our total Scope 3 emissions. And our Scope 3 emissions constitute 87% of our total emissions, which is about a percentage that's on par with the usual facilities management industry. But we have this considerable fleet, which we need to deal with. Now, we partnered with CO2 analysis just over a year ago to assist us with calculating carbon footprints on large product ranges using their AI model. And our plan was to have an accurate view of our overall carbon footprint and determine which suppliers and goods or services we use have the greatest impact. And the project was both cost effective and, just as importantly for us, time effective. Using the data collected, we calculated that even a 1% saving across our Scope 3 spend could equate to a saving of £1.5 million and 300 tonnes of carbon. And the data produced is allowing us to make pragmatic plans for carbon reduction, both internally and in collaboration with our supply chain. And it also helps us to set our science-based targets for verification by the SBTi. So we now have a breakdown of our carbon impact for our major suppliers, our Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, and by product category, account and purchase order codes. And coupled with that supply chain collaboration, which is vitally important, this data is going to assist us with our reduction strategy and allow us to implement carbon reduction programs across the business to help us reach that 2040 net zero target. Now, we already produce bespoke carbon reports for the fuel we use in our service to our customers and also the waste produced. So adding this capability to our offer is a real game changer. Now, we've just started phase 2 of the carbon project, which is essentially life cycle assessments, which has been mentioned previously in presentations. Our ultimate goal is to be able to measure the carbon involved in the products and services we provide to our customers from cradle to grave, and we're well on the way to being able to achieve that. The first product we were looking at is our sanitary bin range, which is one of our best sellers. And our life cycle strategy sends the hygiene waste we collect from them to energy from waste plants throughout the UK. And they produce enough energy to power 12,500 UK homes per year. So it's a great example of a circular economy. Our partnership with EFW plants is unique within our industry, and it's a great example of sustainability in action. We dispose of 98% of that hygiene waste by this method, and we also only send small balance to landfill because of geographical limitations. So that sort of concludes my contribution to this excellent event that Ronald and Lynn have organised, except to add that our parent company Bidvest, which is a South African conglomerate, the official sponsors of the South African Winter Olympics team. So Bidvest are committed to funding and supporting all sports at all levels across South Africa. From their first appearance in 1960, only 12 South Africans have ever competed in the Winter Olympic Games, but this year there are 5, which is the most South Africa have ever sent to the Winter Olympics. All of them have made history to be here, from the athlete who only started skiing 3 years ago, to the first South African woman ever to compete in the skeleton. They've all defied expectation to have the chance to bring South Africa, hopefully, their first ever Olympics winter medal. So this is Team South Africa. Just stop and sharing now, Ronald, and hand back over to you.
Thanks. I'm now going to hand over to Jeff, who was ready to go before my voice has decided to quit to me. So I'll hand you over to you, Jeff. Cheers.
Thanks. Thank you. Make sure you guys give me a thumbs up or yes if you can see my slide here.
Yeah, I can see it. Looks good.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you all. And my sport is the same as Ron's. I'm a skier and used to chase snow for a living. And this is a fun day I had up in the mountains, and I'm in Montana right now. I don't know if you can see the mountains in the background, but I need to be near mountains. So that's my sport. So in our sport, one of the taglines that we used to carry around with us was "Leave good tracks." Talking about railing the edges and leaving good tracks, and you go down go up in the chairlift and you see the rails that you made, and but it's carried with me since my athletic days and leaving good tracks. And it was inspiration a bit for the name of our company, Pretred. And I'll tell you the quick story. But we are a company. In the world of commerce, you can buy goods or you can utilize services. You've heard some of the service work and the procurement work that can really make a big difference in the environment and carbon reduction. And my neighbor is a former athlete, a former kart racer, and a cyclist. And one day we used to have beers on his front porch after cycling, and he showed me this brick of rubber. And I'm like, what the heck is that? He's like, yeah, I think we can do something with it. He was fly fishing, and I live in Colorado. He was fly fishing and saw a bunch of tires, waste tires in the river. And he said, he's an inventor and really a visionary. But we both come from an athletic background and trying to leave good tracks in the world. And that resonates with us. After my athletic years, I spent time on Wall Street and in technology and was in health food for a few decades. But when I saw this, I'm like, this dog is going to hunt. And it was a rubber block, and I threw it up in the air and it bounced on the concrete. And I said, wait, there's 7 billion people in the world and you invented this thing? He said, yeah. So rubber turns out to be a really problematic waste material once tires are used or once any kind of rubber is used. Generates a lot of pollution. And we came up with an innovative product that is really using a lot of material, using a lot of the problem. We are working with governments, and I'm just kind of walk you quickly through that. But Pretred is really kind of an acronym for leaving good tracks. It's, our tagline is build a better way. We build stuff, we got to do it better. And the way we do it turns out to make a big difference in environmental merit. So from a pollution standpoint, be it carbon emissions or just garbage, we kind of started there, as I told you, in fly fishing. He said, that's a problem. And he came at it from a waste. How do we do something with this waste? As it turns out, what we do has a dramatic impact on the reduction of carbon emissions. And where we play is in taking this material. The top two uses in the world for used tires are to burn them and to bury them. And about 1.5 billion tires are generated every year in the world. And so every country, every city, every state, every province, every region turns out to have a problem with tires. And Josh talked about EPR, trying to engage producers to environmentally do something with tires. And the bottom line is innovation is the unlock. Innovation is the unlock around all waste. Most of the waste in the world gets thrown away or burned. That's just the way we are. And in the modern world we live in today, the opportunity, I came at it from, when I saw this rubber brick, I came at it from an entrepreneur perspective. That's kind of my brain. And I saw dollar signs, right? How do you gain economic advantage through environmental advantage? And so they've got to be together for environmental impact to scale. You've got to deliver to the bottom line. And I know Ron and his company, easily do that for companies, showing the dollars. That gets people's attention. And then the environment oftentimes is, oh, that's the icing on the cake. What a cool thing. And that's the thing where you can be proud with your kids to say you're trying to leave good tracks in the world. So, at the end of the day, tires are a big problem, burn and bury. We come along and we say, hey, here's a way to use a lot of material, a lot of rubber, a lot of waste that is going into landfill or being burned, and use it in big monster blocks and barriers. We didn't start with barriers on the brain. Concrete barriers, they're prolific all over the world. We didn't start with that as an idea, but we backed into it through a process of elimination to say, how can we use a lot of material? I didn't, but my neighbor, Eric, and another co-founder who had been in the tire business for decades, say, how do we back into this? And when I saw it, I was like, that dog's going to hunt. That's a great idea, because historically in the world, they're the only viable material for putting these things on infrastructure projects all over the world and roads has been concrete. And so we came up with this idea. 5 years, 6 years later, here we are. We're sold out, we're scaling, we're growing, all good things about growing and making a difference. But what makes this thing tick is a material advantage Which one would you rather hit? Would you rather bash into concrete or bash into rubber? We bring absorption into the mix, whereas concrete is just pure deflection. So, but the economics is, how do you turn a recycled material into an economic advantage? It's got to be better economics than virgin material. We use a lot of tires in every barrier, 70 for a small barrier. We're building a barrier right now that's going to use over 200 tires per barrier. And so it's an advanced manufacturing, advanced material science. We got a whole fleet of engineers working on this. But the idea is, can we build something that delivers performance? Because that's the way the world works, and that's the way my Olympian brain works, is what's the performance advantage? And does it make a difference in the world? And it's great economics too, right? It actually can compete head to head with the sort of standard in the industry, which is concrete. 1,000 barriers reduces carbon emissions by over 4 million kilograms. That's over 9 million pounds in America. 100,000 waste tires just with 1,000 barriers, and that's with our smaller barriers. We can double that with our larger barriers. All these numbers will double with the larger barrier we're going to put on high-speed roadways. And so it's making a difference. And you can explain this to a 6-year-old, which is kind of cool. My younger daughter grabbed onto this really early, and she's been a cheerleader ever since. And that's the fun thing is sometimes, we talk about the climate, we talk about the environment, can get a little abstract. Well, people can see this, touch it, they get it, they get it in 5 seconds. And so a mile, as an example, we can save over 2 million pounds of waste tires in our new large barrier that's going to go onto roadways. It's safer, it's smarter, it's sustainable. And I don't know if you remember, I mentioned circular recycling. The Tokyo Olympic Games was one of the first to introduce circular recycling around electronics waste. Circular policy, circular infrastructure, circular advantages are really sort of, I think, the new language in terms of environmental stewardship. And what does that mean? That just means we can take a barrier and recycle it back into another barrier, right? And so it can always be reuse that material. And I'll just end with a story of how we're working with government, how we're working in a public-private partnership, how enterprise has locked arms with legislators and policymakers, because policy is a lever. When the Olympics chose to bring the environment into the games from a policy perspective, from a resolution perspective, and a value perspective, it changed the way the Olympics sort of happen in the world, right? Every city has to present an Olympic plan on their stewardship. You can see, some of the success cases. Do they get it right every time? No, but they're trying to be an active participant. They're trying to be on the field of play. And for those technologies, for those services, goods and services that are trying to deliver an economic advantage to business, trying to be a steward in the world and offering environmental advantages, I think it's up to the leaders to help policy be an amplifier, be a lever in that regard. We worked with the state of Colorado to design particular policies that incentivize circular end uses. And just that little policy tweak, the money is going to be spent either way to send waste material to the dump or to the incinerator, but could you redirect that policy and send it to upcycle that waste, right? And when one of the legislators in Colorado said to us, he said, when you see a soda can on the ground in a parking lot, you pick it up because you know that that's going to be recycled into another can. And I want that same outcome for all kinds of wastes in our world. And he was really a pioneer legislatively in Colorado. And so now what we're trying to do now is take this policy with other states and other countries. We have countries calling us that want our solution, and we can recycle up to 100 million pounds per line of material. And in Colorado, that's really sort of the playbook that we want to sort of replicate, McDonald's franchises around the world. And I'll just sort of end with sort of a shout out to, LA, we're bringing the Olympic Games to America. And if any on the call know anyone in the Olympic movement, we're trying to get the attention of LA to say, hey, we can just in our little lane, we can make a big difference if we recycle rubber. LA is a concrete jungle, and if we recycle 12 million pounds or 12 million tires, we redirect 300 million pounds of rubber from landfill. If LA just sort of uses their policy and uses the Olympic Games to say, hey, let's just use rubber barriers instead of concrete barriers in the deployment in our community and in a showcase of the Olympic Games, I know the tire companies would love it. And we can reduce 1 billion pounds every 12 million tires that we recycle into our barriers. So I'll leave it there, Boris. And I want to thank Boris for herding the cats and organizing us today. And hopefully we'll do many more of these to come and lead into the LA Games and beyond. So thank you, Boris.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was brilliant. And a great example of how getting rid of supply chains and getting to a circular economy can save the planet and carbon and money as well. So I'm just going to do a quick summary now and explain one thing that we're looking to try and do. We're looking to try and save 1 billion tons of carbon. Can you see this okay, everyone? Yep. So back in, I'll explain about 2010. So the 2010 campaign was there. If anyone wants to do it, there's a documentary called The Age of Stupid that came out in 2009, and it was basically looking back and going, why aren't we doing anything about climate change? 15 years onwards, and it's still very, very, very relevant. But what that kicked off was a campaign called 10 for 10, where people went off and they tried to reduce their carbon by 10% in 2010. 65,000 people joined in, 2,500 businesses, 3,000 organizations, and they saved 1 million tons of carbon. But as we saw from the other things, all the carbon for most of these organizations is not actually in the scope 1 and 2, which is the direct energy. It's from all the other stuff they buy. So 6 is just looking at a smaller reduction, just a 6% reduction, but it's going for the supply chain emissions, which is where all the money in carbon is. And that's got a potential for 2 billion tons of carbon. So it's much bigger. And we're just going for the first billion. If we hit the first billion tons, it'll be 1,000 times bigger than the 1010 campaign. And the other bit that's quite surprising is how few organizations need to take part to make it happen. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has been going on since the 90s. The 250 members account for 25% of global emissions. So that's 15 billion tons. And you can see that, 11% of it is in their scope 1 and 2, and the other 89% is all in what they call the value chain, the supply chain bit. So for them, a 6% reduction is 800 million tons. And so 7.5% gets us up to the billion-ton goal. So you can see just with this small group of organizations, we can get up towards that goal. UK NHS is a massive organization, and we're working with them. They can do this. And as I mentioned earlier, we've analyzed 2.5 trillion and about 600 million tons. So we already know the scale that's required to do this. We've gone off and just created a little website for it called 66, and we're just releasing that today. It's the very first one. It's got lots and lots more work to do in it, but it's just to give you a preview of the idea. But the most important thing is that when you go off and measure supply chain in detail, you find stuff that you don't need. And if you don't need it, don't buy it, save the money. And it's just like the fruit. One of the biggest sources of food waste is people buy stuff that they don't need and then they put it in the bin. Now, as a business, if your business is doing that, not buying the stuff is an immediate cash saving. So that's kind of what we're looking at as your first bit. And the website for 66 is going to be 66global.org, and I just checked it was live. And if you want to come and visit Olympian Climate Champions, it's olympianclimatechampions.org. And I'll just leave this up there for you to look at. And has anyone got any questions they want to put into the chat? Or how would you like to go forward? And firstly, thank you very much for being with us today. Whilst I'm waiting for people to perhaps type something in the chat, it's been an interesting day because we're in the middle of selling our house, and in our attic today, the hot water pipe burst just before we started this meeting, and it then went down and brought down a couple of ceilings and turned off the electrics in the house, which is why I had to go to a shed to sort of kick things off. And so big thanks to Jeff for coming in and stepping up. Yeah, so thanks, Jeff. So my vision for Olympic climate champions is that one of the reasons we're both Olympians, and the thing about it is that every time we competed, we knew that if we wanted to win, we had to go faster than we did last year. So in cycling, Team Sky talked about marginal gains where they made 1 or 2% improvements every year. And what I know when I work with these big organizations is that they've got a real mess. And so going in there and analyzing everything they do, shining a light in it, bringing it up to the surface means that they can actually make really big improvements. And we've seen this from lots of different customers. So my vision is kind of connecting Olympians and those elite athletes who know about continuous improvement when you're already the best in the world. And I can tell you that most organizations are not the best in the world when it comes to buying their stuff. There are a group that are. Heidi's NHS supply chain, amazing logistics, just-in-time delivery, automated barcode scanning. The only organizations that compare with them are the major supermarkets. You know, it's the same thing. You go to the till, you scan it gets scanned, automatically replenished. But I'll tell you that even the supermarkets are really bad at their indirect stuff. So anything that's not on the shelf, they're almost as bad as the other businesses on it. And so the vision is to connect Olympians with these organizations to help make them world class and save that 1 billion tons of carbon that we can see there as a bunch of quick wins. Any other questions coming up? Well, I'm going to say thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. Before I wrap up, I just want to give you one bit of news, which is that there's over 100 Olympians have written a letter to the IOC to ask that fossil fuels are banned from Olympic advertising. This is something that the Olympics did a while ago. We banned tobacco advertising in Olympic sport, and that then cascaded down to the rest of the sport. And we're hoping to do the same thing again with fossil fuels and to start that process going. Okay, so I'll say thank you once again to Jeff, Josh, Heidi, and Graeme, and thank you everybody for attending, and I'll stop now.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Don.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers, everyone.
Bye for now.